Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 18, so let's get into it. The house in Bedstoy was Julia's first safe house, and it was the end of Stanford. She was never going to college now. It was her parents' hearts broken for the second and final time. It was too terrible to think about, so she dealt with it by not thinking about it. She could have said no, of course. She could have finished dialing the number of the car service and turned her back on the man with the pork pie hat and waited till the black town car came and gotten in and repeated her home address to the Guatemalan Highlander behind the wheel until he finally understood and whisked her away from it all. Or she couldn't have, but she wished she could. She wished it then, and she would re-wish it many times in the years to come. But she couldn't walk away because the dream of magic, wasn't dead. She tried to kill it, to beat the life out of it with work and drugs and therapy and family and the free traders, but she couldn't. It was stronger than she was. The owlish young man who was working the door of the Bedstoy safe house that night was named Jared. He was about 30, not tall, with a bright smile and heavy black stubble and heavy black glasses. He'd been working on a doctorate in linguistics at NYU for the past 9 years. Nights and weekends, he worked magic. They weren't all like that, nerdy, academic, what you'd think. It was a surprisingly heterogeneous crowd. There was a 12-year-old prodigy from the neighborhood and a 65-year-old widow who drove down from Winchester County in a BMW SUV on weekends. In all, there was a rotating cast of about 25, physicists and receptionists and pipe fitters and musicians and undergrads and hedge fund guys and barely functional, socially marginal nut jobs. And now there was Julia. Some of them came in once a month to work on spells, and some of them showed up at 6 in the morning every morning and stayed till 10 at night, or slept there, though house rules kept that to a minimum. Some of them were high-functioning in their daily lives and careers and families and no obvious signs of eccentricity or physical debilitation. But doing magic alongside all that other stuff was a tricky balancing act, and when you lost it and fell, you hit the floor hard. Even if you got up again, you got up limping, and everybody fell sooner or later. See, when you had magic in your life, it turned out, when you lived the double life of a secret underground magician, you paid a certain price, which was that your secret other life pulled at you always. Your magician self, that loopy doppelganger, was always with you, tugging at your sleeve, whispering silently that your real life was a fake life, a crude and undignified and inauthentic charade that nobody was really buying anyway. Your real self, the one that mattered, was the other one, the one waving her hands around and chanting in a dead Slavic dialect on the busted-ass couch in the lime-green cupboard house on Throop Avenue. Julia kept her job, but she was at the house most nights and all day on weekends. The lust was back. Then this time, it looked like she could slake it. She had the scent, and she was going to make the kill. She went quiet on FTB. The free traders could wait. They were used to members dropping off the grid unexpectedly for months or years at a time. In the chronic mood disorder community, that was well within normal operating parameters. As for her parents, Julia cut herself off. She knew what she was doing, and she knew how hard it would be for them, watching her fall back into the obsession and get skinny again and stop bathing and all the rest of it. And she did it anyway. She felt like she had no choice. It was an addiction. Thinking about the consequences for her family, really thinking about them, would have annihilated her with remorse. So she didn't. The first morning, she caught herself absent-mindedly, almost sensuously, running a thumbnail along her arm at the breakfast table, leaving a red line behind, or rather when she caught her mother catching her do it, no words were spoken. But she saw part of her mother die that morning, and Julia did not take heroic measures to resuscitate her. Julia could have died that morning, too, she knew. She almost did. But you let a drowning woman cling to you, she'll drag you down with her. And what's the point after that? That's what she told herself, anyway. You have to look her in the eye and pry her fingers off your arm and watch her sink down into the airless green depths and perish there. It's either that or you'll both die. What's the point? Her sister knew that. You could see the disappointment in her brown, foxy eyes. Then you could see it change and harden into something clear and smooth and protective. She was young enough she could still swerve around the wreck and keep moving. She let Julia go, her sister with her black secrets. Smart kid. She had made a sensible deal. Julia made one too. And what did Julia get for her deal? When you put your family and your heart and your life and your future up on the block, how much does that net you? What do you walk away What do you walk away with in return? Show her what she's won, Bob. A lot, it turns out. A motherfucking load of arcane lore is what it gets you, for starters. That first day they tested her, from the second you got in the door, Jared actually started up the stopwatch widget on his iPhone as she crossed the threshold. You had 15 minutes to learn and execute the flash spell that Quentin punted at the Winston safe house, or you had to leave, and you couldn't come back for a month. They called it, boringly, the first flash. You could try again at another safe house, of course. They didn't share information. But there were only 2 in New York City. So if you wanted to get your magic on in the 5 boroughs, you had to go big or go home. Tired as she was, Julia did it in 8 minutes flat. If she'd had any muscle tone left over from her rainbow witch phase, she wouldn't even have needed that long. As it turned out, they didn't know the rainbow spell, so she printed out the scan she'd downloaded from the internet that one time. It was all ready 2 years ago now, and brought it in. Jared, the linguist, with great pomp and ceremony, encased it in a transparent plastic sleeve, punched the sleeve with a 3-hole punch, and added it to a tatty duct-taped 3-ring binder in which they kept the club's spells list. A 3-ring binder. That's what they had by way of a spell book. And they called it the Spellbinder. That should have tipped Julia off. Still, it increased 20-fold the sum of Julia's information about magic, and that was a joy beyond measuring. Under Jared's tutelage, or whoever the senior magician in the house on any given day happened to be, she worked her way through the book. She learned how to stick things together with magic. She learned how to light a fire at a distance. She learned a spell to guess a coin flip, and to keep a nail from rusting, and to take a magnetic charge off a magnet. They competed with each other to see how many everyday tasks they could do with magic, opening jars, tying their shoes, buttoning buttons. It was a bit random, and it was a bit small potatoes, but it was a start. Nail by nail, magnet by magnet, she began to force the world to conform to her specifications. Magic. It was what happened when the mind met the world, and the mind won for a change. There was another binder of hand exercises, much battered from having been thrown across the room in frustration, and she started work on them too. Soon she had the book memorized, and she did the exercises all the time. In the shower, under the table at mealtimes, under her desk at work, at night as she lay in bed. And she got serious about her languages. Magic wasn't just a math thing, it turned out. As she learned spells, she gained levels. Yes, levels. That's what they called them. The lameness of the level system, borrowed wholesale from Dungeons and Dragons, which must have borrowed it from Freemasonry, she supposed, was not deniable, but it did keep things orderly, and it kept the hierarchies clearly defined, which Julia liked more and more the higher she rose in them. She began the tattoos on her back. She took care to leave a lot of room because she was learning fast. It took her a month to realize that she was learning faster than the other regulars at the safe house, and another 3 months to realize just how much faster. By that point, she had 7 stars, which was as many as Jared had, and he'd been at it for 3 years. Probably at Breakbills, she would have been just another apprentice, but she wasn't at Breakbills, was she? She was here, and here she stood out. The others just didn't seem to have any flair for the theoretical side of magic. They learned their spells by rote, but they weren't interested in the basic patterns that underlay them. Only a few of them went into the deeper linguistic work, the grammars and the root systems. They preferred to just memorize the syllables and gestures and forget the rest. They were wrong. It sapped the power of their casting, and it meant that every time they started a new spell, they were starting over from scratch. They didn't see the connections between them, and you could forget about doing any original work, which Julia was already looking forward to. Along with Jared, she started an ancient languages working group. They only got 4 other members, and most of those were there because Julia was hot. She picked them out one by one when they didn't keep up with the homework. As for the hand exercises, she worked doubly hard at those because she knew she wasn't naturally gifted at them. Nobody kept up with her on the hand exercises, not even Jared. They didn't have her taste for pain. Much as she hated Breakbills with a red glowing hatred that she kept carefully burning in some inner brazier, blowing on it if it ever sank too low. She could see why they kept things exclusive there. A lot of riffraff came through the Throop Avenue safe house. Julia had always had a nasty competitive streak. In the past, she'd done her best to keep it under wraps. Now she reversed that policy. With no one to check her, she nurtured it and let it flower. As Breakbills had humiliated her, so she would humiliate anybody who couldn't keep up with her. Hey, magic's not a popularity contest. Throop Avenue would be her own private Breakbills. Any visitor who came to the Throop Avenue safe house rocking a level equal to or less than Julia's had better come to play. Any bullshit you were walking around with, you would be called on. It didn't matter if you were black or white or tired or sick or 12. It was amazing, truly incredible, how many magicians were faking their way through this shit. It made Julia furious. Who issued these people their stars? You gave some of these other safe houses a little push and they fell over like houses of cards. It was dispiriting, is what it was. She'd finally found a magic school of sorts to call her very own, and it was barfing out a bunch of fakers and cheats. On the strength of Julia's bedside manner, the Throop Avenue safe house began to get a bit of a reputation. They didn't get quite so many drop-ins anymore, and some of the drop-ins they did get got ugly, as in physical. Bullshitters don't like being called on their bullshit, and there was a considerable Venn diagram overlap between people who were into magic and people who were into martial arts. But I'm sorry, where did you think you were, motherfucker? Connecticut? You're in a magic safe house in Bed-Stuy, borough of Brooklyn. There was a considerable Venn diagram overlap between people who lived in Bed-Stuy and people who had motherfucking guns. Fool. Welcome to New Dork City. Still, even with Julia's crusade for magical rigor, bringing up the general tone of things, there was a problem at the Bed-Stuy safe house, and that was its 3-ring binder, the Spellbinder. Every once in a while, a visitor would drop by who meant business, and they'd know a spell that wasn't in the book. And if that was the case, and if the book contained a spell that they didn't know, a swap might be arranged, and the book would grow. But such transactions were frustratingly infrequent. Julia needed to grow faster than that. It didn't make sense. Where did these spells come from in the first place? What was the source? Nobody knew. Turnover was high at safe houses, and institutional memory was short. But more and more, Julia suspected that somebody out there was operating on a much higher level than she was, and she wanted to know who and where and how and now. So Julia turned it around. She became a visitor. She'd hung onto the Civic from her Chesterton days, and she quit her job troubleshooting networks and started putting miles on it. Sometimes by herself, sometimes with Jared riding shotgun. Safe houses weren't easy to find. They hid their locations from the wider world, but also from one another, because safe houses had been known to go to war, and that usually resulted in mutual annihilation. But sometimes you could coax an address out of a friendly visitor. She'd gotten good at coaxing. If all else failed, she had the power of the bathroom hand job, and she wielded it with an iron fist. And some safe houses were bigger than others, and some were big enough and safe enough that they'd allowed themselves to get a little famous, at least within the scene, on the strength of their belief that they were big enough that nobody could fuck with them. The binder she was handed in an old, repurposed bank building in Buffalo was so thick it made her fall on her knees and weep. She stayed there for a week, uploading magical knowledge into her starving brain by the terabyte. All that summer, she roamed north into Canada, west as far as Chicago, south to Tennessee and Louisiana, and all the way down to Key West. A back-breaking, clutch-grinding, vinyl-sticky trip that yielded a face-palmingly disappointing 12-page spellbook and a cat-infested bungalow next door to the Hemingway home. It was Julia's wandering period. She crashed on spare beds and in motels and in the Civic. When the Civic quit on her, she got into hot wiring cars off the street. She met a lot of people, and some people who weren't people. The more rural houses occasionally played host to minor demons and lesser fairies, and local geo-specific nature spirits and elementals, who lent street cred to the establishment in return for God knows what in the way of goods and services. She didn't ask. There was a certain romance to these beings. They seemed to embody the very promise of magic, which was to deliver unto her a world greater than the one into which she had been born. The moment when you walk into a room and the guy playing pool has a pair of red leather wings sticking out from his back, and the chick smoking on the balcony has eyes of liquid golden fire, at that moment you think you'll never be sad or bored or lonely again. But Julia got to the bottom of those beings pretty fast, and once she got there, she often found someone who was just as desperate and confused as she was. That was how Julia got mixed up with Warren, and that was the lesson she learned. At any rate, her back was filling up with 7-pointed stars. She had to put the big 50 spot on her neck to save space. It was unconventional, but conventions were there to make it easy on the fakers and cheats. You had to bend conventions to make room for somebody like Julia. But Julia was running out of steam. She was a freight train of magical pedagogy. But that train ran on information, new data, and fuel was growing scarce. And what there wasn't of the best quality. The potatoes were too small. Every time she walked into a new safe house, she did so with her hopes high, but her hopes were dashed more and more often. It went like this. She pushed open the door, accepted the ogling gazes of the local males, showed off her stars, intimidated the ranking officer into showing her the binder, which she leafed through listlessly, expecting to find, and finding nothing she didn't already know. Whereupon she dropped the binder on the floor and walked out, letting Jared make her apologies for her. This was bad behavior, and she knew it. She did it because she was angry and because she disliked herself. The more she disliked herself, the more she took it out on other people. And the more she took it out on other people, the more she disliked herself. There's your proof, Mr. Hofstander. I am a strange loop. Sure, she could have lit out of the West Coast or made a run for the Mexican border, but she had a feeling she already knew what she would find there. In the looking glass world of the great magical underground, appeared to be perspective appeared to be reverse. The closer you got to things, the smaller they looked. Objects in mirror were farther away than they appeared. Put another way, how many coin flips could one girl predict? How many nails could she protect from rust? The world was not in urgent need of more demagnetized magnets. This was magic, but it was chicken shit magic. She had turned into the choir invisible. She had tuned in to the choir invisible, and it was singing game show jingles. She'd put her entire life down as a deposit on this stuff, and it was starting to look like she'd been taken. After all she'd been through, all she'd sacrificed, that was more than she could stand. She wondered for a while if Jared could be holding out on her. If he knew something she didn't, but she was pretty sure that wasn't the case. Just to make sure, she deployed the nuclear option. Nope, 0. Oh well. To be absolutely honest, she deployed the nuclear option a few times on her travels, and she was starting to feel a bit like a nuclear wasteland herself, irradiated and toxic. She didn't like to think about it. She didn't even name it to herself. Nuclear was the code word, and she kept those memories encoded, never to be decrypted. She'd done what she had to do, that was the end of it. She no longer even fantasized about real love. She couldn't imagine it anymore. Her and it being in the same world. She'd given it up for magic. But nuclear winter was coming, and magic wasn't keeping her warm. It was getting cold. Tainted snow was falling, and the earth was getting thirsty again. Thirsty for balm. The black dog was hunting. Julia was feeling it again. The blackness. Or really, blackness would have been a relief. Blackness would have been a field trip compared to where she was headed, which was despair. That stuff had no color. She wished it were made of blackness, velvety, soft blackness, that she could curl up and fall asleep in, but it was so much worse than that. Think of it as the difference between 0 and the empty set, the set that contains nothing, not even 0. These but the trappings and the suits of woe. All these seem to laugh, compared with me, who am there? Epitaph. December came and the days shortened. Snow quietened the traffic on Throop Avenue, and then one day, St. Lucy's Day, as it should happen, the day of the dawn poem, it all went down, and when it did, it went down Western style. A stranger came to town. She had a nice look about her, the stranger, an Ivy League look. 29 maybe, dark suit, dark hair pulled back and secured with crossed chopsticks. A round face, baby fat, nerd glasses, but hard. There might once have been a time when she was pushed around, but that time was long past. As per Throop Avenue protocol, as soon as she was in the door, the big gun stepped to her. The big gun being Julia. Well, Ivy League took off her jacket and unbuttoned her cuffs. Both arms were sleeved in stars up to the shoulders. She spread them wide, in the manner of our Savior, to show a 100 spot on the inside of each wrist. The room got very quiet. Julia showed Ivy League her stars. Then Ivy League made her prove it. This had never happened to Julia before, but she knew the drill. She would have to walk through every spell she knew, every test she'd ever passed, to satisfy Ivy that she had earned her stars. Step by step, level by level, coins, nails, fires, magnets, the whole utility belt, from level 1 to level 77, which was as far as Julia had gotten. It took 4 hours, while the sun set and the short timers and day students went home. Of course, Julia lived for this shit. She only flubbed a couple in the mid-50s, but the bylaws allowed her a few retakes, and she got through it, shaking but still fierce. Whereupon Ivy League nodded coldly, rolled down her sleeves, put her jacket back on, and left. It took all of Julia's pride not to run after her, shouting, "Take me with you, mysterious stranger!" She knew who that must have been. That was one of the others. The people who had a line on real magic. The pure shit. Ivy League had been to the source, where the spells came from. Julia had known they were out there just by the way they perturbed the universe. Like a black planet. And she'd been right. Finally, they'd shown themselves to her. They'd tested her, and just as Breakbills had, they'd found her wanting. There must be a flaw in her, one that she couldn't see, but obvious to those who looked for it. It wasn't till she got home that she found the card in her pocket. It was blank, but a complex unlocking enchantment revealed a message printed on it in Old Church Slavonic. Burn this. She burned it in an ashtray, using not a simple conflagration spell, but rather the 43rd level one, which did basically the same thing, but did it in 14th position and in Old Church Slavonic. The flame flashed violet and orange rhythmically. The flashes were Morse code. The Morse code spelled out a pair of GPS coordinates, which turned out to correspond to a microscopic hamlet in the south of France. The hamlet was called Mers. It was all very free trader Beowulf. At last, Julia had been called. The fat envelope had arrived. This time, she was really going. She had put down her bet a long time ago, and finally, it was showing signs of paying off. How to explain all this to her parents, who you would have thought would have been way past caring. She was 22 now. How many times were these people going to make her break their hearts? But as much as she dreaded the conversation, it went better than she expected. She hid a lot from her parents, but one thing she couldn't hide from them was that she actually felt hopeful for once. She believed that she had a shot at happiness now, and she was taking it. It seemed like it was years since she'd felt that way. Her parents understood that somehow, and they weren't upset. They were happy for her. They let her go. Speaking of letting people go, she dumped Owlish Jared, the not-so-cunning linguist, on his pale and bony ass. Call me when you finish that dissertation, pork pie. One fine day in April, Julia boarded a plane, bringing with her none of her worldly possessions, and flew to Marizil. On the lurid blue Mediterranean Sea. She felt so light and free. She could have flown there under her own power. She rented a Pegway that she would never return and drove north for an hour, negotiating a typically French ronde point every 100 meters. Turned right at Cavillon and got lost 80 times near Gourds, a spectacular village perche that clung vertiginously to the side of the Luberon Valley, as if it had been plastered there with a trowel. She rolled into sleepy, tiny Mers at 3 in the afternoon, in the heart of photogenic Provence. And lo and behold, it was a little gem, a largely unturretized clump of old houses built from strangely light emitting bleached brown southern French stone. It had one church and one castle and one hotel. The streets were medieval and paint-scrapingly narrow. Julia stopped the car in the town square and took in the heartbreaking World War I memorial. Half of the dead had the same last name. The GPS coordinates were 10 minutes outside of town. They corresponded to a handsome farmhouse afloat all by itself in a sea of hay and lavender fields. It had sky-blue shutters and a white gravel driveway in which she parked her scraped-up Peugeot. Or Peugeot? Peugeot. A clean-cut man, only a little older than Julia, answered the door. He was handsome. You got the impression that he hadn't always been clean-cut, that he'd lost a lot of weight at some point in his life. It had left behind some interesting lines on his face. "Hello, Circe," he said. "I'm Pouncy Silverkitten. Welcome home." That's it for this week. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 19. It's the longest chapter in the whole book, so expect it to be over an hour. See you guys.